The moment my daughter-in-law set the plate in front of me, I knew something had shifted. Not just at that table, but in the whole shape of my life, as I had known it. It was a Tuesday in late November. Outside, the first real snow of the season was pressing itself against the kitchen window in soft, wet clumps, the kind that sticks to branches and makes everything look briefly beautiful before it turns to slush. I had spent the afternoon making a proper roast shoulder of beef, carrots, potatoes, the whole thing slow-cooked the way my mother taught me. The smell had filled the house for hours. I thought it might bring everyone to the table in good spirits. I was wrong about that. My son, Trevor, sat at the head of the table. He had taken that seat somewhere along the way without either of us acknowledging it. His wife, Sasha, brought out the plates. She set one in front of Trevor, thick slices of the roast, golden potatoes, a generous pour of the pan gravy I had made from scratch. She set one in front of herself, equally full. Then she went back to the kitchen and returned with a smaller plate. A bowl, really. And she slid it in front of me without making eye contact. Inside it was last night's pasta. Cold. The sauce had dried at the edges, and there was a fork mark through the middle where someone had already sampled it. Then put it back. I sat there and looked at it for a moment. I am 67 years old. I worked for 31 years as a registered nurse at St. Holm. Michael's in Toronto. I have buried a husband and raised a son and paid off a mortgage in a city that did not make that easy for anyone. I am not a woman who cries at the dinner table, so I did not cry. I picked up my fork and I ate the cold pasta, and I listened to them talk about a trip they were considering Cancun, all inclusive, sometime in February. I want to explain something before I go any further, because I know what people think when they hear a story like this. They think, why didn't she say something? Why didn't she stand up for herself right then and there? And I understand that reaction. I used to think the same thing when my patients would tell me about the things they had absorbed quietly over years. But when it is your own child, sitting across from you, your own child who you rocked through fevers and drove to hockey practice at 6 a.m. and sat up with after his first heartbreak, the instinct is not to fight. The instinct is to find a reason to tell yourself you are misreading things, that it was a misunderstanding, that tomorrow will be different. I had been telling myself that for 11 months. Trevor and Sasha had moved into my house the previous January. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Trevor had been laid off from his position at the logistics firm downtown, and they had been renting an overpriced condo in Mississauga that ate through their savings faster than either of them expected. Sasha worked as an aesthetician at a spa in the annex, which covered some costs, but not enough. When Trevor called and asked if they could stay with me for a few months while they sorted things out, I said yes, without hesitation. He was my son. Of course I said yes. What I did not anticipate was what a few months would come to mean. By March, Trevor had found contract work. Not the salary he had before, but enough to cover basics if they were careful. They were not particularly careful. By April, Sasha had started charging things to the credit card I had given Trevor for emergencies, a card attached to my account. One I had handed over during a particularly stressful week when he had said his own card had a fraud hold and he just needed to pick up groceries. The groceries were $340. The week after, the same card was used at a spa on Bloor Street for $180. Then a fitness studio membership. Then a clothing purchase. I only noticed because the statement came in the mail and I sat down and read every line. I did not say anything immediately. I want to be honest about that. I made excuses in my own head. Sasha works at a spa. Maybe the charge was professional. The fitness studio, maybe they both needed it for their mental health. It had been a hard year. I am a nurse. I spent 31 years finding compassionate explanations for difficult behavior. It is a hard habit to let go of, even when it is working against you. By June, I had stopped looking at the card statements altogether. That was my mistake. And I own it fully. They made themselves comfortable in my house, in ways that were gradual enough that I never quite registered any single moment as the crossing of a line. Sasha rearranged the kitchen to suit herself. The good mugs my late husband Robert brought back from a trip to Vancouver Island ended up in a box in the basement without my being asked. Trevor began using my parking spot without mentioning it, which meant I was walking an extra block and a half in the cold after my early shifts when I was still picking up occasional casual work at the hospital. Small things, the kind of things that, when you list them out, sound almost too small to mention, but they accumulate. That is what no one tells you. They accumulate the way water gets into a foundation slowly, invisibly, until one day the wall cracks. The spa bill came on a Friday afternoon in October. Sasha knocked on my bedroom door while I was resting. She had a printout in her hand, which I thought was unusual. She sat on the edge of the chair near the window, the one I use for reading, and she explained that her workplace had a staff appreciation event the following week, and she needed to get some things done beforehand. Highlights: a facial, a full set of nails. She said it casually. The way you might tell someone you need to pick up milk. Then she held out the printout. It was a booking confirmation. The total was $470. She looked at me and said, "I figured you could just put it on the card." I looked at the paper. I looked at her. I said, "I'll think about it," which was the first honest boundary I had drawn in 11 months. And she looked genuinely surprised, a little annoyed. She left the room, and within the hour I could hear her on the phone, her voice low. And then Trevor came upstairs and sat in the same chair and told me that Sasha was upset and that it would mean a lot to him if I could help out with this one thing. She does a lot around the house. "Mom," he said. I looked at him. My son, the same boy who once fell asleep in my lap during a long car trip to Sudbury, his whole weight trusting me completely. "I know she does," I said. He left. I sat in the quiet of my room and I listened to the house around me, the television downstairs, the sound of Sasha opening the refrigerator, the particular creak of the third stair from the bottom that Robert had always meant to fix and never did. I had been in this house for 22 years. I had raised Trevor in this house. Robert had taken his last breath in the room at the end of the hall. I thought about the cold pasta. I thought about the parking spot and the mugs in the basement and the $470 printout sitting on my nightstand. And for the first time in 11 months, I did not look for a compassionate explanation. I slept very little that night. Not from distress, or not only from distress, mostly because my mind had become very clear and very quiet. The way it used to get in the early hours of a long shift, when everything that was not essential fell away, and I could see exactly what needed to be done. I lay in the dark, and I thought through things carefully. I thought about what I had, what I had allowed to happen, and what I was going to do about it. By 4:30 in the morning, I was dressed, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, and I wrote down every step in order. I have always been a list person. Robert used to tease me about it. He said, "I once made a list of my lists." I wrote slowly and deliberately. And when I was done, I read it back twice to make sure I had not missed anything. Then I folded the paper and put it in the pocket of my cardigan. I left the house just after 7. The snow from earlier in the week had hardened overnight into a pale, firm crust that crunched under my boots. The street was quiet. A neighbor's tabby was sitting on a porch, railing, watching me with the particular indifference of cats. And the sky over the rooftops was just beginning to go gray-pink at the edges. I stood on the front step for a moment and breathed the cold air, and then I walked to my car, which was parked around the corner because Trevor's vehicle was in my spot. My first stop was the bank. I have banked at the same branch on St. Clair since Robert and I were first married. The branch manager at that time, a cautious man named Gerald, had talked us through our first mortgage with such care that I had felt, for the first time, that we might actually manage to own a home in this city. Gerald had long since retired, but I knew the current manager, a woman named Patricia, by name and by sight. Patricia was already at her desk when I arrived, and she stood up when she saw me come in, the way she always did. I sat down across from her and I explained the situation plainly. I said that the emergency credit card attached to my account had been used by someone other than myself for several months, and I wanted to understand the full extent of the charges before I took the next steps. Patricia was a careful listener. She pulled up the account and printed the last 12 months of statements, and we went through them together. By the time we were done, I had a clear and complete picture of exactly what had been charged to my account in that time. It was not a small number. I asked Patricia to close the card immediately and issue a new one. Only to me, not connected to any other account. She made the arrangements while I sat there. Then I asked her about transferring the bulk of my savings, my RRSP, my TFSA, the checking account Trevor had access to, into accounts that only I could reach. Patricia did not ask unnecessary questions. She had been in this business long enough to understand when a woman sitting in front of her had already done her thinking. By 9 o'clock the accounts had been restructured. By 9:30 I was at the office of a lawyer named Margaret, whose name I had taken from the bulletin board at my parish 3 years ago and never thought I would need. Margaret was a small, precise woman with short gray hair and a way of making you feel that she had seen every possible version of every possible situation. I told her what I needed. She listened without interrupting. Then she told me what she could do and approximately how long it would take. I signed the papers she needed me to sign. I asked the questions I needed to ask. When I left her office at 11:15, the sun had come up properly, and the slush on the sidewalk was beginning to melt at the edges, and I stood outside for a moment with my hands in my coat pockets and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. I did not go back to the house until late afternoon. I had lunch alone at a small Greek restaurant on the Danforth that Robert and I used to go to on anniversaries, and I sat by the window and had the lemon soup and a glass of water, and I watched the street, and I did not feel sad. I felt precise, like a decision that has been made after a long and careful deliberation. When I came home, Trevor and Sasha were both there. Sasha was on the couch with her phone, and Trevor was in the kitchen reheating something. I said hello, and I hung up my coat, and I went upstairs. I did not mention the morning. I did not mention anything. The following morning was a Saturday. I was downstairs making oatmeal when I heard Sasha's voice from the hallway, louder than her usual register. She was talking to Trevor, and I could hear enough to understand that her card, the one she had been using, had been declined at an online checkout the night before. She had tried it again that morning for something else, and it had been declined again. She came into the kitchen doorway and looked at me. "There's something wrong with the card," she said. "I know," I said. "I canceled it." The silence that followed was particular, the kind that has weight and texture. "You canceled it," she repeated. "Yes," I said. I also went over the statements from the past year. With the bank, there were quite a few charges I wasn't aware of. Sasha opened her mouth and then closed it again. Trevor came in from behind her, and I could see from his face that he had heard enough to understand what was happening. What I had not anticipated, what genuinely surprised me, was what Trevor did next. He did not defend Sasha. He did not argue with me about the card. He stood in the doorway of my kitchen, in my house, and he looked at his wife. And then he looked at me, and something moved across his face that I had not seen there in a very long time. Something that looked unmistakably like shame. "Mum," he said. "How much?" It was not a question. Quite. It was the sound of a man who has just seen something he had been avoiding, looking at directly. I told him the number. He put his hand on the counter. He was quiet for a long time. Sasha left the room, which was perhaps the most sensible thing she did in all those months. Because I think if she had stayed and begun to justify things, it would have cost her whatever remained of Trevor's goodwill in that moment. Trevor and I stood in the kitchen, and we talked for close to an hour. Not a fight. I want to be clear about that. I have always been skeptical of the idea that repair requires volume. We talked quietly. He said things I could tell he had been carrying for a while. Things about pressure and embarrassment, and not knowing how to ask for help directly. I said things that I had been carrying too, about feeling invisible in my own home, about the parking spot, about the mugs, about the November dinner. I said it all plainly and without heat, and I watched him take it in. He cried once. Briefly. He pressed his fingers against his eyes and got himself together, and I did not reach over and tell him it was fine, because it was not entirely fine yet. But I let him have the moment. Sasha and Trevor moved out 3 weeks later. They found an apartment in Hamilton smaller than they would have liked, but within their actual means. Trevor has been paying me back in monthly installments, a number we agreed on together and put in writing. Margaret helped with that documentation too. He does not miss a payment. He calls on Sundays now. Not every Sunday, but most of them. We talk about ordinary things, the weather, a show he is watching, how the drive to work has been. Once, about 2 months after they moved out, he said, "I don't know why I let things get that way." "Mum," I told him I didn't entirely know either, but that we had both learned something, and that was worth something. He said yes. I believed him. I have put the mugs back on the shelf. I sleep well now. I wake up early out of habit. 31 years of hospital shifts will do that to you, and I make tea and sit at the kitchen table with whatever book I am in the middle of. And the house is quiet in a way that feels like rest rather than absence. The cat from down the street has started coming to my back step in the mornings. I have been feeding it sardines, which Robert would have found completely unreasonable, and which I find very satisfying. Last week, my friend Donna came for dinner. I made the beef roast again, shoulder of beef, carrots, potatoes, the gravy from scratch, and we sat at the table and ate together and talked until almost 11 o'clock, which is late for both of us now. When she left, she said, "You seem like yourself again." I said I was. She said, "Good." She drove away down the street and I stood on the front step and watched her taillights disappear, and then I stood there a while longer in the cold air. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I want to say something to anyone who might be listening to this and recognizing something of their own life in it. Not advice. Exactly. Because I am not in the business of telling people what to do. Just something I learned. There is a kind of generosity that comes from love. And there is a kind of generosity that comes from fear. Fear of losing someone. Fear of conflict. Fear that if you draw a line, your child will stop loving you. Those two kinds of generosity look almost identical from the outside. They do not feel the same from the inside. One of them builds something, the other hollows you out. Slowly. Until one November evening, you are sitting at your own table, eating cold pasta, and telling yourself, it is probably fine. It took me 11 months to tell the difference. I am 67 years old. I have a lawyer I trust. A bank manager who does not ask unnecessary questions. A good wool coat. And a cat who is not technically mine but comes when I call anyway. My son's number is in my phone, and it rings on Sunday mornings, and I pick it up. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot.